The operations room at Army Group Center headquarters near Smolensk maintained an atmosphere of exhausted determination in late July 1941 as senior German staff officers compiled situation reports documenting another week of intense combat that had achieved impressive tactical results. Soviet forces encircled, territory captured, advances measured in tens of kilometers, yet had also revealed patterns that troubled the professional military men who understood that operational success had to translate into strategic decision within timeframes that Germany's multi-front commitments and resource constraints made essential. General Franz Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff, stood before the situation maps, studying the symbols representing German divisions that had advanced hundreds of kilometers from the Polish border in 5 weeks of continuous operations, had destroyed entire Soviet armies in massive encirclement battles, and had captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners in what appeared to be vindication of Wehrmacht operational excellence and validation of the Blitzkrieg doctrine that had achieved stunning victories in Poland and France. But as Halder absorbed the details of the latest intelligence assessments, reports documenting Soviet units appearing in numbers that exceeded pre-war estimates, evidence that Soviet industry was producing tanks and aircraft at rates German planning had not anticipated, and most troublingly, the recognition that despite catastrophic losses, the Red Army showed no signs of the imminent collapse that Barbarossa planning had assumed would follow the destruction of Soviet forces in border battles, he experienced the cold realization that would progressively spread through the German High Command over the following months. The war in the East would not be concluded quickly, as Operation Barbarossa's timeline assumed. Germany was committed to prolonged campaign against an enemy whose resources and resilience had been systematically underestimated. And the strategic situation that Germany faced was transforming from manageable challenge, requiring operational excellence, into existential threat, requiring resources and sustained effort that exceeded Germany's capacity to provide while simultaneously defending against Britain and preparing for potential American entry into the conflict. The German High Command's realization that the war would be long emerged gradually, rather than through a single moment of recognition, shaped by the accumulation of evidence throughout the summer and fall of 1941, that contradicted the assumptions underlying Barbarossa planning, and that revealed fundamental miscalculations about Soviet capabilities, about the timeline required to achieve decisive victory, and about Germany's capacity to sustain major operations across the vast spaces of the Soviet Union, while maintaining positions and commitments in other theaters. The recognition came at different times to different officers, depending on their positions, their access to intelligence, and their willingness to acknowledge that planning assumptions had been wrong. But by December 1941, when German forces had been driven back from Moscow's approaches by Soviet counter-offensives, and when winter conditions were creating catastrophic supply and equipment failures, the realization was becoming universal among professional military officers capable of objective assessment. Germany had committed itself to exactly the kind of prolonged multi-front war that strategic planning had been designed to avoid, and the prospects for achieving decisive victory through military means alone were diminishing as the correlation of forces shifted progressively against Germany. The first indicators that the campaign might not proceed according to plan appeared within days of Barbarossa's launch, though their significance was not immediately apparent to commanders focused on the tactical and operational successes that characterized the invasion's opening phases. The border battles that destroyed multiple Soviet armies and that captured over 300,000 prisoners in the Bialystok-Minsk encirclements demonstrated Wehrmacht operational superiority and validated the decision to concentrate armor in panzer groups that could achieve deep penetrations and rapid encirclements. But German intelligence officers noted that the destroyed Soviet forces represented only a portion of Red Army's strength, that substantial Soviet forces had escaped the initial encirclements and were retreating eastward in varying states of organization, and that Soviet resistance in some sectors was fierce despite the tactical hopelessness of their situation. Patterns that suggested Soviet forces would not simply collapse once subjected to military pressure, but would continue fighting even when rational military calculation suggested surrender was the only sensible option. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center and responsible for the main thrust toward Moscow, sent assessments to OKH throughout July that mixed professional satisfaction with tactical achievements and growing concern about operational implications of what those achievements were revealing. The encirclement at Smolensk in mid-July destroyed another Soviet army group and advanced German forces to within 400 kilometers of Moscow. But the battle consumed 2 weeks of intensive combat and revealed Soviet capabilities to organize defensive positions and counterattacks, despite the catastrophic losses they had suffered in the border battles. Von Bock noted that Soviet forces were fighting with determination that exceeded expectations, that they were employing tanks in numbers that intelligence had suggested they did not possess, and that the pace of German advance was slowing, not because of declining German capabilities, but because of the mounting challenges of sustaining operations across extended supply lines, while simultaneously reducing encircled pockets that continued resisting rather than surrendering promptly. The logistical situation that emerged in July and August provided some of the clearest evidence that the campaign timeline was unrealistic and that prolonged operations would create challenges that German planning had not adequately addressed. The assumption that Barbarossa would be completed within months had shaped logistics preparations in ways that made sustained operations across vast Soviet spaces extremely difficult. The railway gauge difference between European and Soviet systems created bottlenecks at the frontier where supplies had to be transferred between different rolling stock. The primitive state of Soviet road infrastructure meant that vehicles advancing across unpaved roads consumed fuel and suffered mechanical breakdowns at rates that planning had not anticipated. And the distances involved meant that even when supplies could be moved forward, they arrived in quantities insufficient to sustain the operational tempo that rapid victory required. General Adolf Hitler, Chief of Operations at OKH and responsible for coordinating Army Group activities, compiled assessments in August that documented the progressive degradation of German combat power, even as forces continued advancing and achieving tactical victories. German divisions that had begun Barbarossa at full strength were now operating at 60 to 70% of authorized personnel due to casualties that exceeded replacement flows. Tank strength in panzer divisions was declining from combat losses and mechanical failures that could not be adequately addressed in field conditions. The Luftwaffe was suffering aircraft losses that, while sustainable in absolute terms, were degrading operational capabilities because maintenance and supply challenges in primitive Soviet airfields meant that serviceability rates were declining even when aircraft were not lost to combat. Most troublingly, the cumulative effect of these various degradations meant that German forces were becoming progressively weaker even while continuing to advance, creating a situation where achieving objectives became more difficult precisely when those objectives needed to be achieved quickly if the campaign was to be concluded before winter. The intelligence arriving at Wehrmacht headquarters throughout August and September about Soviet military capabilities and industrial production revealed systematic failures in pre-war assessment that had shaped Barbarossa planning in fundamentally flawed ways. German intelligence had estimated total Soviet tank strength at around 10,000 vehicles before the invasion, and had assumed that destroying this force through the initial encirclements would eliminate Soviet armored capability. But by late summer, German forces were encountering Soviet tanks in numbers that exceeded these total estimates, suggesting that either pre-war intelligence had been catastrophically wrong about Soviet tank inventories, or that Soviet industry was producing replacement vehicles at rates far exceeding German assumptions. The reality was that both factors were operative. German intelligence had dramatically underestimated Soviet pre-war tank strength, and Soviet industry was producing tanks at rates approaching 1,000 per month, even while factories were being relocated to avoid German advances. The T-34 tank that German forces began encountering in significant numbers during the summer represented another dimension of intelligence failure and planning inadequacy. German assessments had assumed Soviet equipment would be inferior to German weapons, and that any qualitative advantages would favor German forces. The T-34 challenged these assumptions with armor that German anti-tank weapons struggled to penetrate. With mobility that exceeded German tanks in Soviet terrain conditions, and with a gun that could destroy German armor at ranges that made tank combat dangerous for forces that had expected qualitative superiority. The appearance of T-34s in numbers suggested that Soviet armored forces would not simply disappear after initial defeats, but would continue to appear throughout the campaign with equipment that was, in some respects, superior to German tanks, and that would require tactical adaptations and new weapons to counter effectively. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief military adjutant and commander of OKW, struggled throughout the summer to reconcile the optimistic situation reports about tactical successes with the troubling indicators about campaign duration and resource requirements that strategic assessment suggested. Keitel's position made him responsible for coordinating between different theaters and for ensuring that resource allocation aligned with strategic priorities. But the accumulating evidence suggested that Barbarossa's resource requirements exceeded what had been planned, and that the campaign was consuming forces and material needed for other theaters without achieving the decisive results that would justify such expenditures. The tension between Hitler's insistence that the campaign was proceeding successfully and the professional military assessments indicating serious problems created situation where Keitel was caught between his role as loyal subordinate, reinforcing Hitler's confidence, and his responsibility to provide accurate strategic assessment. The debate in late July and August about operational priorities revealed fundamental disagreements about how to proceed once it became apparent that Soviet resistance was not collapsing as quickly as planned. Hitler's directive to divert forces from Army Group Center's drive toward Moscow to support operations in Ukraine, leading eventually to the massive Kiev encirclement, reflected his emphasis on economic objectives and his conviction that capturing Ukrainian resources was more important than taking Moscow. The military professionals, particularly Halder and von Bock, argued that concentrating forces toward Moscow offered the best prospects for achieving decisive victory before winter because Moscow was the political capital, the transportation hub, and the symbolic center whose fall might trigger broader Soviet collapse. The fact that this fundamental strategic debate was occurring in August, 2 months into a campaign that planning had assumed would be largely concluded by that point, demonstrated that the timeline assumptions were already proven false and that difficult choices about priorities had to be made precisely because the campaign could not achieve all objectives within available time. The Kiev encirclement in September, which captured over 600,000 Soviet prisoners and was tactically one of the most brilliant operations in military history, also represented the strategic choice that made Moscow's capture before winter impossible. The time consumed in executing the Kiev operation from late August through late September was time that would have been needed for advancing on Moscow, and by the time German forces could resume the Moscow offensive in October, the autumn rains had begun turning roads to mud, and winter was approaching rapidly. The operational success at Kiev thus came at strategic cost of ensuring that Barbarossa's primary objective could not be achieved in 1941, demonstrating how tactical brilliance could not compensate for strategic timeline failures, and how the vast spaces of the Soviet Union made achieving multiple objectives simultaneously impossible within time frames that quick victory required. The resumed drive toward Moscow, Operation Typhoon, launched in October with forces weakened by months of continuous combat and with timeline pressures that made the operation desperately urgent yet increasingly difficult. The initial successes that encircled Soviet forces at Vyazma and Bryansk, and that advanced German spearheads to within 80 kilometers of Moscow by mid-November, suggested that capturing the capital might still be possible. But the combination of autumn mud that immobilized vehicles, progressive Soviet reinforcement of Moscow's defenses with forces transferred from the Far East, and the approaching winter created conditions where German advantages in mobility and operational excellence were progressively neutralized, while Soviet advantages in fighting in their own territory under winter conditions were becoming more pronounced. General Heinz Guderian, commanding 2nd Panzer Army, and one of the primary advocates of armored warfare whose theories had shaped panzer employment throughout the campaign, sent increasingly pessimistic assessments to Army Group Center in November, describing how his forces were being ground down by combination of combat losses, equipment failures in cold weather, and supply shortages that left units without fuel and ammunition needed for sustained operations. Guderian's tanks were literally freezing. Lubricants designed for European climate conditions were solidifying in temperatures reaching -30 degrees Celsius. Engines would not start, weapons would not function reliably. The soldiers lacked winter clothing because planning had assumed the campaign would be concluded before serious winter conditions developed, leading to casualties from exposure that rivaled combat losses and that created morale problems among troops who recognized they were suffering from planning failures rather than from unavoidable battlefield conditions. The Soviet counteroffensive launched in early December by forces that German intelligence had not known existed. Armies transferred from the Far East after intelligence suggested Japan would not attack the Soviet Union drove German forces back from Moscow's approaches and ensured that Barbarossa's primary objective would not be achieved in 1941. The counteroffensive demonstrated Soviet operational capabilities that contradicted assumptions about Red Army incompetence, revealed that Soviet forces retained offensive capability despite catastrophic losses suffered since June, and most troublingly, showed that the Red Army was learning from its defeats and developing tactical and operational approaches that could exploit German vulnerabilities. The fact that these Soviet offensives were occurring in December, 6 months into a campaign that planning had assumed would be largely concluded by that point, made undeniable what professional military officers had been recognizing for weeks. The war would not be short. Germany was committed to prolonged campaign in the East, and the strategic situation had fundamentally deteriorated from what Barbarossa planning had anticipated. General Franz Halder's diary entries from December 1941 documented his progressive recognition that the campaign had failed to achieve its strategic objectives and that Germany faced prolonged war of attrition against an enemy with greater resources than Germany could match, while also defending other theaters. Halder noted that German casualties since June 22nd exceeded 750,000 men, losses that represented over 20% of the invasion force, and that could not be adequately replaced given Germany's manpower constraints and commitments in other theaters. Tank losses meant that panzer divisions were operating at fraction of authorized strength, and the replacement vehicles arriving from Germany could not compensate for losses while also expanding armored forces to levels needed for operations across the vast Eastern Front. Aircraft losses and the demands of defending Germany against British bombing meant that Luftwaffe could not maintain the air superiority that had characterized early Barbarossa operations, creating conditions where Soviet air power would progressively contest German air operations. But the resource calculations that most troubled Halder and other professional strategists involved not just the immediate losses and replacement difficulties, but the broader implications of prolonged war in the East for Germany's overall strategic position. The decision to invade the Soviet Union had been based partly on assumption that quick victory would eliminate the Eastern threat and would free German forces to concentrate against Britain or to prepare for potential American entry into the war. The failure to achieve quick victory meant that German forces would be committed to major operations in the East indefinitely, that the bulk of Wehrmacht combat power would be consumed in campaigns against the Soviet Union, and that Germany would lack the forces needed to defend adequately against threats from other directions. The multi-front war that German strategic planning had always sought to avoid was now Germany's reality, and the prospects for managing such war successfully were diminishing as resource constraints became more acute. The comparison between German and Soviet industrial capacity revealed fundamental asymmetries that made prolonged war increasingly disadvantageous for Germany. Soviet industry, even after losing substantial territory and industrial capacity in the Western USSR, was producing tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition in quantities that exceeded German output in many categories. The factory relocations that moved Soviet industry east of the Urals created production capacity beyond German reach, and ensured that Soviet war production would continue and would progressively expand regardless of how much territory Germany captured in the European USSR. German industry was operating at high capacity but faced resource constraints, particularly in oil and certain strategic materials, that limited production expansion, faced Allied bombing that was beginning to disrupt manufacturing, and had to support operations across multiple theaters rather than concentrating on single front. The personnel situation was equally troubling for German strategic prospects. Soviet population exceeded German population substantially, and Soviet willingness to accept casualties at rates that would break other societies meant that Red Army could sustain losses and continue fielding forces, even after suffering catastrophic defeats. German casualties were approaching levels that strained replacement capacity, and the quality of replacements was declining as experienced soldiers were killed or wounded and were replaced by hastily trained recruits who lacked the combat effectiveness of the professionals who had begun Barbarossa. The progressive degradation of German infantry quality was partially masked by continued tactical competence of veteran formations. But the underlying trend was toward army that was numerically weaker and qualitatively less effective than the force that had invaded in June. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group South and responsible for operations in Ukraine and toward the Caucasus, provided assessments in late 1941 that emphasized the impossibility of achieving all assigned objectives with available forces and within timeframes that strategic situation required. Von Rundstedt's forces had captured vast territories, had destroyed multiple Soviet armies, and had secured economically valuable regions, including much of Ukraine's agricultural and industrial areas. But these achievements had not translated into strategic decision. Soviet forces continued appearing in numbers that suggested unlimited reserves. The captured territories required occupation forces that reduced combat strength available for offensive operations, and the approaching winter made continuation of major operations impossible, regardless of what objectives remained unachieved. The winter crisis of December 1941 and January 1942 crystallized the recognition among German high command that the war would be long, and that Germany's strategic position had fundamentally deteriorated. Hitler's stand-fast orders forbidding retreats created situations where German forces held exposed positions without adequate winter equipment or supplies, suffering casualties from cold and from Soviet attacks while unable to conduct the kind of mobile defense that Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized. The relief and dismissal of senior commanders who argued for tactical withdrawals, including von Brauchitsch as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, von Bock from Army Group Center Command, and Guderian from his Panzer Army, demonstrated that Hitler would not tolerate professional military judgment that contradicted his determination to hold ground regardless of cost. But beyond the immediate winter crisis, the broader strategic implications of Barbarossa's failure to achieve quick victory were becoming apparent to those willing to see clearly. Germany was now committed to major operations in the east that would consume the bulk of Wehrmacht's strength indefinitely. The Soviet Union had demonstrated resilience and resource depth that made prospects for achieving decisive military victory increasingly doubtful. The industrial and population asymmetries favored the Soviet Union in prolonged conflict. Allied support for the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease was beginning to provide material assistance that would help sustain Soviet war effort. And most ominously, the United States had entered the war in December 1941, meaning that Germany would soon face American industrial capacity and military power in addition to fighting the Soviet Union and Britain. The planning discussions that occurred during winter 1941-42 about operations for the following year revealed how the recognition that the war would be long was shaping German strategic thinking, even as that recognition was incomplete or was not fully acknowledged. The decision to pursue limited objectives in 1942, rather than attempting to achieve complete Soviet defeat, reflected understanding that resources were insufficient for operations on the scale of Barbarossa, and that German forces needed to focus on achievable goals. The emphasis on capturing Caucasus oil fields reflected recognition that Germany's oil situation was becoming critical, and that economic objectives had to take priority given the resource constraints that prolonged war created. But the continued belief that renewed offensive operations could achieve decisive results demonstrated that full acceptance of the war's likely duration and of what that duration meant for Germany's prospects had not yet occurred. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's December counteroffensive and the Soviet winter campaign of 1941-42 demonstrated that the Red Army was learning from its defeats and was developing operational capabilities that would progressively match and eventually exceed German performance. The fact that Soviet forces could conduct coordinated offensives across multiple sectors, could achieve tactical surprise despite German awareness that attacks were coming, and could sustain operations in winter conditions that paralyzed German forces revealed that assumptions about permanent German operational superiority were false. The Red Army of December 1941 was qualitatively different from the force that had been shattered in the border battles. It had learned combined arms coordination, had developed effective defensive tactics, and was beginning to demonstrate offensive capabilities that suggested future operations would be far more difficult than Barbarossa's initial phases had been. The broader geopolitical situation that emerged from Barbarossa's failure reinforced the recognition that Germany faced prolonged war against enemies whose combined resources exceeded German capacity. Britain remained undefeated and was receiving increasing American support that would eventually enable major operations against German positions in North Africa and eventually in Europe itself. The United States was mobilizing industrial capacity that would produce war material in quantities exceeding all other nations combined, and American forces would eventually be deployed in theaters where they would directly engage German forces. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic losses, had demonstrated staying power that made prospects for achieving decisive victory doubtful. The alliance among these three powers, unlikely as it was ideologically, was cemented by their common enemy, and their coordination would progressively improve as the war continued. The resource constraints that became apparent during winter 1941-42 demonstrated how prolonged war would progressively exhaust German capacity. Oil shortages were affecting all operations and would only worsen as the war continued. Steel production was sufficient for current needs, but could not be expanded sufficiently to match Allied production while also replacing combat losses. Food supplies were adequate but required continued access to occupied territories and to imports that Allied naval power was progressively interdicting. Manpower was becoming critical constraint as casualties mounted and as the economy needed workers for war production. Each of these constraints would become more acute as the war continued, progressively limiting German operational options, while Allied advantages in resources grew more pronounced. The psychological impact on German high command of recognizing that the war would be long was profound and shaped how officers approached their duties for the remainder of the conflict. Some maintained optimism that German tactical excellence and new weapons under development would restore advantages and enable ultimate victory. Others recognized that the war was probably lost, but continued serving from duty or from inability to imagine alternatives to continued resistance. A few began considering how to extricate Germany from the war through negotiated settlement, though the Allied policy of unconditional surrender and Hitler's unwillingness to consider anything short of total victory made such efforts futile. The common thread was recognition that the quick, decisive victory that Barbarossa planning had promised was not going to occur, and that Germany faced years of warfare under conditions that increasingly favored its enemies. When the German High Command realized the war would be long, a realization that emerged gradually through summer and fall 1941, and that became undeniable during the winter crisis, they were recognizing that the entire strategic framework that had shaped Barbarossa planning was flawed, that assumptions about Soviet weakness and rapid collapse were wrong, that Germany's resource advantages over the Soviet Union were illusory, and that the correlation of forces was shifting against Germany in ways that made ultimate victory increasingly unlikely, regardless of tactical excellence or operational brilliance. The recognition came too late to alter fundamental strategic trajectory. Germany was committed to the Eastern Front and could not withdraw without surrendering all territorial gains and facing Soviet counteroffensives that might drive into German-held territory. The war would continue for 3.5 more years, consuming millions of lives and vast resources, but the outcome was essentially determined once it became clear that quick victory was impossible and that Germany faced prolonged conflict against enemies whose combined strength exceeded German capacity to resist indefinitely. The tragedy was that this recognition occurred among professional military officers who understood strategic realities, but who lacked authority to alter fundamental decisions, while Hitler and the Nazi leadership, who possessed that authority, were psychologically and ideologically incapable of accepting what military logic demonstrated and continued to pursue total victory long after such objectives had become impossible to achieve.